is there's already underway a serious conflict between the Persians and the Greeks that is going to be really the reason behind the next major phase of our development in history. And so I thought it would be worth our while tonight to take a look at the history between the Persians and the Greeks and see how things develop between them, so that when we come back after the gospel meeting and we begin talking about the conquest of Alexander the Great, which directly impacts the Jews, we have a little bit of a background understanding of the whys and wherefores for Alexander doing some of the things he did. Okay? So, now, the Persians, of course, come into our story in the Old Testament under Cyrus the Great. In 550 BC, before the close of the Old Testament, Cyrus comes to power initially as a sort of vassal king to the Median Empire. The Medes were in power northeast of Babylon, and they controlled a lot of that country that is today the northern part of Iran and several of the Stan countries. You know what I'm talking about, all the stands up in there? And so they controlled some of those. And they had a number of vassal nations, just like most any powerful empire did, one of which was the Persians. And so Cyrus comes to the throne when his father dies. His father's name is Cambyses I. And Cyrus comes to the throne, and depending on which account of history you read, either the Median king decided to attack Cyrus, or Cyrus decided to attack the Median king. Like I say, the historical accounts are not all on one page on that, but what they all agree on is the outcome of it was that Cyrus defeated the Medes and took over the entire Median Empire. Now, what we typically think of as people who study the history of the Bible is Cyrus rises to power and then he takes Babylon and decrees freedom to the Jews to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. And that's not wrong, it's just not complete. Cyrus did not immediately turn his sights toward Babylon, even though, geographically speaking, Babylon was much closer to his center of operations, which was in kind of the middle of the old Assyrian Empire. Instead, he turns his attention due west. And he begins to push into what we know today as Turkey. At that time, it was known as Asia Minor. Now, the farther west you go in Asia Minor, the more you begin to encounter Greek culture. Okay. Now, the Greeks, center of operations was the Greek Peninsula, which is properly part of Europe. Asia Minor is properly part of Asia. But like most any culture, they didn't just stay in a nice, neat little geographical box. And so they had spilled over into the eastern parts of Asia Minor. And in particular, you had the kingdom of Lydia, and you had 3 settlements along the coast of Asia Minor. And they were all Greek in nature. You might call them sort of tribal settlements in a sense. You had the Aeolians, the Ionians, and the Dorians. And they were located north to south, just one right after another, right down the western coast of what we know today as Turkey. All right? So Cyrus turns to the west. He invades Lydia. Now, does anybody happen to know who the king of Lydia was at this time? He's famous and legendary.
The money.
The money guy, Croesus. Croesus. You ever heard the saying, as rich as Croesus?
Yeah.
He was known for being exceptionally wealthy. And he legendarily consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether or not to go to war with Cyrus. And the story goes that the Delphic oracle gave him a very cryptic response, as the oracle was known for doing, and said, "If Croesus goes to war with Persia, he shall destroy a great empire." Of course, you could ask the question, which great empire will he destroy, his own or the Persian? Well, he obviously assumed the latter interpretation, goes to war with Cyrus, loses spectacularly, and Cyrus ends up taking over most of Asia Minor, including Ionia, which means he's pushed all the way to the coast of the Aegean Sea. All right? Now, why is that important for our purposes? Well, number one, he sets up what's called a satrapy. Do you remember in the book of Daniel reading about satraps under the Persian Empire? Those were regional governors. He sets up one of those in the city of Smyrna. Now, we've heard of Smyrna somewhere before? Not Smyrna, Sardis. I'm sorry, Sardis. You've heard of that one too, right? Where? Same place you heard of Smyrna. It's one of the 7 churches of Asia that we read about in the book of Revelation. Most of the cities that are involved in this conflict are cities that we read about in the book of Acts, where Paul's missionary journeys take him through these cities. And in the world in which Paul lived, these cities were famous and had a long history of great battles and wars and things that had happened there. Well, he sets up a satrapy there in Sardis, and he employs these men to rule the territories that he has conquered under the satrap, and they are called tyrants. Now, I'm not using that word in the descriptive sense of like a despotic ruler. That was actually the word that they used to describe these men, the tyrants. Okay, so he sets up these tyrants to rule this land, and then he turns his attention south and he takes Babylon, and that's the part of the story that we're familiar with. Of course, 539 he conquers Babylon. 3 years later he issues what we know as the Edict of Cyrus, where he gives permission for the Jews to go back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem, the temple of God, and they do that. 6 years later, he dies. Okay? He dies in 530 BCE, and he is succeeded by his son, Cambyses II. Cambyses, I've gone to sleep. Getting into this in just a moment. Wake up. There we go. Cambyses rules for only 8 years. But Cambyses has an ambition that was an empire killer. And we've already talked about this in the context of other empires. He wants to conquer Egypt. And so he turns his attention toward Egypt. Now, he does something that undermines his rule in furtherance of his ambition to conquer Egypt, and that is he greatly increases the taxes on the people that are already under Persian rule. Now, that, of course, is a historically proven way to win friends and influence people, right? And so as he heads off with the massive portion of their army to try and conquer Egypt, leaving behind this massive empire full of people who now have to pay way more taxes than they ever did under his father, of course, they're just happy as a lark to do that, right? And so they quickly began to call him names and talk bad about him and have thoughts of rebellion and all these sorts of things while he's down in Egypt. Well, sure enough, he's down there fighting the Egyptians, which is never an easy fight, and rebellions begin to spring up back home. And so he heads back home, but in the process he becomes injured in his leg, and he gets gangrene and he dies. Well, people back home aren't too upset about this. And in the meantime, there is a man who is known as Bardia, who assumes the throne for a short period. Now, I put his name in parentheses there because it really depends on the account that you're reading as to whether it was in fact Bardia or not. Cambyses had a brother named Bardia, and the person who assumed the throne upon his death claimed to be his brother Bardia. But some of the ancient historians, not the least of which is Darius the Great himself, said this was not Bardia. This was an impostor who had put Bardia to death and claimed to be Bardia and was really a usurper of the throne. Well, at any rate, he only ruled for a few months before Darius comes in. He's the son of Cambyses. He comes in, deposes him, and takes over the rulership. Now, I tell you all that to say this. Darius the Great ends up expanding the Persian Empire as large as it ever would be expanded. Okay? So now looking at our maps here, Cyrus invaded Asia Minor. Now what I'm showing you here on the map is the most western edge of Asia Minor. So think Turkey as far towards America as you can get. Okay? And the purple there at the top these are the Aeolian or Aeolian civilizations. The green is the Ionian, that's under Persian rule now, thanks to Cyrus. And you have a satrap in Sardis, and you have tyrants in the cities. Okay? And then down at the bottom in the blue is the Dorian civilization. Now, this is where things get interesting. In 499, all right, who's still on the throne? At this point, Cyrus is. This gentleman, whose name is Aristogoras, is the tyrant in one of the cities of the Ionians, and he plans this expedition to take the island of Naxos. Naxos has certain resources and things that he thinks will be beneficial. The Persians back him in this expedition. Well, he goes to Naxos and he loses, gets defeated pretty soundly. And he begins to fear that his position as tyrant is going to be removed as a consequence of losing this battle. And so, in order to try and secure his position, he decides to stir up a revolt against the Persians. There are already all of these Ionians who are Greek, by nature, who sort of resent being under a tyrant, and they don't like being subject to the Persians. And so he goes back home and he stirs up the leading citizens of the Ionians, and they begin what is known as the Ionian Rebellion. And the first thing they do is march on the city of Sardis. They capture it and they burn it to the ground. Now that's the seat of the satrapy, right? That's the governmental seat of the Persian Empire in this region. They've just sacked it and burned it to the ground. Well, imagine what Persia is going to do. Same thing Persia always does. They defend their territory. So in 497, the Persians attack and they get defeated. That's an interesting development. Why are the Persians defeated? Well, let's think about what's going on in 497. 497 is early in the reign of Darius. He's having to put down a number of rebellions that sprung up during Cambyses' rule, way to the east. Now remember how large the Persian Empire is. It reaches nearly to India. Okay? And there are rebellions and things going on. He's having to put down rebellions, establish his kingdom far to the east. He's also still cleaning up the mess that Cambyses left in Egypt. And so he's really got his hands full, and now this battle springs up. The Persians attack, they get defeated at the Battle of Pedasus, and then in 494, they capture the city of Miletus. And that ends the revolt. Now, have we heard of Miletus? Yeah, we read about it in the book of Acts, right? It's one of the cities that Paul went through on his missionary journeys. Okay, so that's, 400 years later. But the Persians capture Miletus. That puts down the Ionian revolt. The Persians are not done, though. They have to assert power in the region. And so they come back in 492, and under a man by the name of Mardonius, who's son-in-law to Darius the Great, they come in and they capture Thrace. Now, think in your minds, if you can see on the map, Thrace is north and east of the Greek peninsula proper. It's in the orange there. So now they control Asia Minor and they control Thrace. Now, Thrace is not, properly speaking, a super cosmopolitan area. In other words, it's primarily rural, agricultural. But if you're Persian, where do you have your eyes set? I mean, if you're going to deal with these Greeks and you're going to put them under your control, where are you looking at this stage in history? Two main cities. Anybody know what they are?
Well, Athens and Corinth, maybe. I don't know the other one.
Athens is right. Corinth hasn't really risen to prominence yet. Not to the level it will be later on. Athens famously had a rivalry with one other city-state. Remember what it was?
Sparta.
Sparta, that's right. And there's this ongoing rivalry between Athens and Sparta, but pretty much everybody in the Greek peninsula is allied with either Athens or Sparta. And if you can conquer Athens and Sparta, you've got the Greek peninsula. Well, if you've got the Greek peninsula, you've also got the seat of the budding European culture, the most advanced European culture of the time, right? Because in Athens, you've got, the philosophers, the scientists, and people of that nature. In Sparta, you've got some of the most advanced war technicians there are at the time. Okay, so they begin to look to Athens and Sparta and the Greek peninsula. The next step toward that direction is Macedonia. Now, who do we know that's from Macedonia that's going to be very prominent in our later history? Alexander. Alexander's initial position was king of Macedonia. He was the son of Philip of Macedon. Okay? So they subjugate Macedonia. They don't technically annex it. They just make it a client state, but it is fully subservient to the Persian Empire. They have to pay tribute to the Persian Empire. They have to swear allegiance to the Persian Empire. They are 100% under the control of the Persian Empire and have no sovereignty of their own. The next step, of course, is Greece proper. All right? So then we have the Battle of Marathon. Y'all remember reading about this in world history in school? What's the Battle of Marathon famous for?
The runner who ran to tell him about the victory.
That's exactly right.
And fell dead.
The Greeks unexpectedly defeat the Persians at the Battle of Marathon. Okay? Unexpectedly, because the Persians had this massive, overwhelming army. The Greeks have some pretty advanced battle techniques and a pretty good army of their own, but everybody thinks the Persians are going to win just by virtue of the massive numbers they could muster. Okay? But at the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks win. They flank the Persians, they defeat them, box them in, and run them off. And famously, the Greeks send a runner back to Athens from the plain of Marathon where this battle's taking place to announce victory. From the battlefield of Marathon to the city of Athens is allegedly 26.2 miles. The runner runs 26.2 miles at the top of speed that he can muster, comes to the center of Athens and cries out, "Nike," and then dies of exhaustion. Does anybody know what Nike means in Greek?
Victory.
Victory. In America, we say Nike. And it is literally the inspiration for the brand of athletic wear, shoes and whatnot. Nike shoes is based on the story of the Battle of Marathon because they began making running shoes. Okay? So there's your little bit of trivia for the night. But at any rate, the Greeks win unexpectedly, and this is not entirely a Greek win. Because prior to the battle at Marathon, the Persians had won a number of victories. Number one, they've taken basically all the islands in the Aegean Sea. Now, why is that important? Well, one of the main things that the Greeks rely on is their navy. Their navy is a very important part of their ability to wage war. Now, if you are in control of all the islands in the Aegean Sea, you've got a position to be able to pick off the Navy and harass the Navy and keep them occupied and give them trouble and keep their ships in disrepair and all that sort of stuff. So they've got that. They've also got the city of Eritrea, which is an important city. So you see how the balance of power is constantly in flux here between the Greeks and the Persians, okay? So we go a little farther. The Persians come back, and this time they muster the largest army they've ever mustered. They're not going to settle for defeat. The scholars are massively at odds with one another about how many were actually mustered. Herodotus says that it was about 2 million soldiers. Modern scholars say no, it couldn't possibly be nearly that many. The only thing is Herodotus lived a whole lot closer to the actual event. Although, I will say this, put an asterisk by it, because even Aristotle, who lived very shortly after Herodotus, said Herodotus was an old storyteller and sort of discounted some of the things he said as tall tales. We don't know how many exactly were in the Persian army, but it's pretty unanimous among the ancient writers that it was a massive, massive army. In order to meet this battle, King Leonidas I, who was the king of Sparta, mustered an army that began with 300 men. They were going to meet the Persians at the pass of Thermopylae. Y'all know this story? Have you seen the movie? Is that the source of your knowledge of this story? Oh, you're killing me. He takes his 300 soldiers and whatever allies he can muster in addition to his 300 soldiers, and they stop up the pass of Thermopylae. Now, legend has it that the Persian leader of the army sends word to Leonidas and says, "Lay down your arms and we will let you live." And he responds with two famous Greek words. Anybody know what they are? Ethan, I know you know them.
Come and take it.
What is it?
I don't know how to say it.
Don't know how to say it?
Molen Lab.
Molan Labe. What does it mean?
Come and take.
Come and take them. Come and take them. In other words, you'll pry them out of our cold, dead fingers. That's sort of become a motto for folks who want to be sure and defend the Second Amendment in the United States, but a lot of them don't know what it means. It means come and take them. Legend also has it that someone told Leonidas that the Persians had so many archers that their arrows would blot out the sun, and he replied, "Good, we shall fight in the shade." I mean, this guy was fearless, and he really was. He's quite a heroic character in the ancient writings. And so he and his soldiers for 3 days hold off the Persian armies at the pass of Thermopylae. Now, eventually, depending on which accounts you read, either someone turned traitor and showed the Persians a way to go around and flank him, or else they just figured it out on their own. But at any rate, Leonidas learns that the Persians are in the process of going around and flanking him from behind, and he sends the vast majority of his army to leave, to get out of there before the Persians destroy them. And he falls back with his men to defend the rear. And they hold off the Persians long enough for the body of the army to get away. And then he and his soldiers make this headlong charge into the Persian army. It's a suicide charge. They know they can't win, but their goal is to kill as many Persians as they can kill and hold them back as long as they can hold them back. And at least in that, they're relatively successful because they stymie the Persians long enough for a naval battle that's going on down in Salamis to take place where the Greeks win. And the reason the Greeks win is because of the Persian numbers. The Persians not only had this massive land army, they had a massive navy. But the Greeks lure them into the Straits of Salamis. And there's one big problem if you've got a massive navy with tons and tons of ships. If somebody lures you into a tight little area, guess what? Yeah, you bottleneck. You can't maneuver. You can't get all of those ships into position to set up and defeat the smaller navy. And so here is this huge Persian fleet bottlenecked up in the strait, and the smaller fleet of the Greeks just starts picking them off and defeats them. And so the Persians have to go back home and go back to the drawing board. Well, the years that are going on here we're getting down now into the 470s. Now let's look back over here. Darius has already died. Okay. Now we're dealing with Artaxerxes. And sure, he wants to take Greece. But look at the resources he's already expended. These massive campaigns, massive armies, massive navies, all of which are a long way geographically from his center of power over really to the east of Mesopotamia. Okay? So he's stretched out. He's also still dealing with Egypt that Cambyses got them into. And Egypt is a quagmire for anybody. Plus, he's still got to keep everything going back home. And so there's a period here where there's not a lot happening. But from 479 to 449, for about 30 years, the Greeks are just skirmishing. Whenever they can engage the Persians, they engage them. And they win some important battles. All right? So we go on down. Around 449, we don't have really good records, but it appears that the Greeks were able to get the Persians into a position where Artaxerxes agreed to a peace treaty. Okay. And so for a period of time, there is a peace between the Persians and the Greeks. Now, when I say peace, I'm put an asterisk by that word, okay? It's not that they're suddenly friends and get along and they're just trading with one another and everything's hunky-dory. They just decided to quit expending resources on fighting. Now, it's really honestly amazing that the Greeks were able to get this far, because while all of this is going on, you've still got Athens and Sparta that are, periodically at war with one another. They're at the very least politically vying for power. There's all kinds of stuff going on in Greece, but somehow they're able to hold off the Persians enough that they back off for a period of time. Now here are the Jews, the biblical people, down in Palestine and over in Babylon and down in Egypt. Not a whole lot is happening with them as far as history tells us. In other words, we don't have a lot of records of any particular uprisings or momentous events. But they're being touched by all of these events. And they're getting ready to really be touched by these events, because this animosity that's been building up now for a couple of generations between the Persians and the Greeks is going to be the animating spark for the campaigns that Alexander's going to take. And that's going to directly affect all of the Jews, the ones in Palestine, the ones in Greece, and the ones in Babylon. And it's going to affect that entire area of the world. Okay? Questions, comments on this history? Yes, sir.
Cyrus defeats the Medes, but there was a Medo-Persian Empire. When is that?
Well, that's generally what we refer to as Cyrus's empire, because he sort of, and honestly, Greg can answer that better than I could, but he sort of absorbs the Median Empire. Is that roughly accurate, Greg?
But I have heard people say that the Persians are the descendants of the Medes.
Yeah.
You heard that?
There's definite kindred there, I think, for sure.
What's left of the Persian people.
It's interesting, during Cyrus's lifetime, you often do hear it referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire. By the time of Darius, it's just usually referred to as the Persian Empire.
Who did you say were kin to the Medes, or the remnants of the Medes?
The Persians. The Persians, yeah.
Which that's all Iran and everything now, right?
Basically, yes, sir. All up in that area, north of, let me think, north Iraq and a lot of Iran, but it's up around the Caspian Sea, up in that area.
And their idea today is return to the great power that we're talking about, that the Persians were at this time.
Right.
Right?
Well, yes, sir, with an admixture of Islam that didn't exist at this time. So, good point. Now, don't sleep on the Romans. They haven't become the world power yet that they're going to become. But while all this is going on in the western part of the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans and the Carthaginians, Carthage, remember, is located on the northern coast of Africa. The Romans and the Carthaginians are having some pretty legendary fights among themselves. It just hasn't spilled over to where it begins to affect the Jews yet. But this stuff with the Persians and the Greeks, even though it may not have direct impact on the Jews yet, it's going to have a direct impact on them in the 300s. Okay?
Daniel, where does the story of Esther and King Ahasuerus, where do they fit in?
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Ahasuerus of Esther's story is probably Cambyses. And this all, of course, takes place in Susa, which is far to the east in modern-day Iran. But I believe that's correct. If not, it may have been Xerxes or Artaxerxes that come after Darius, but I believe it's Cambyses. I knew that at one time, Gary, and off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly. I can find that out and have you a better answer at the next class. Good question, though, but yes, it's definitely going on during all of this. Remember, the Old Testament ends approximately around 400 BC, So we're still in biblical times when a lot of this is going on. Good question. Wish I had a better answer.
When is Alexander fixing to come on the scene?
333, I believe, is when he begins his campaign. 330 is when he has the first big victory against Persia. So it's coming up very soon.
Hey, Daniel. I just did a quick search, but it says that Esther, it started around 480
480.
BC.
Okay, so 480 would put her after Darius. Okay, thank you.
Which would put her after Nehemiah too, right?
No, I'm almost positive she falls during the time frame that's covered by the book of Ezra. Almost positive about that, because remember, in Ezra, they have to deal with a number of Persian kings over the matter of rebuilding the temple. Cyrus had initially authorized it. Cyrus dies. Cambyses listens to the opponents and says, no, you can't build it. Then there's a period of, I think, about 16 years there, during which Cambyses dies. Bardia comes to the throne, gets deposed. Darius comes to the throne, and finally they're able to petition him, and he gives permission to restart the building. Good question, though, and I was thinking she would probably fall, I suppose, after the temple was completed then, given what Tommy's just told us. Good questions, all. I'll try to do a better job of having a picture of where Esther and the kings fit in next time.
You're doing a good job.
Thank you so much for your attention. You're free to go.
So you're fishing tomorrow.